It was just getting light in the military camp when the duty officer was already mercilessly banging a ladle on a frying pan. The squad leader, Eric, stirred with displeasure and covered his head with his hand from the loud sounds. He absolutely did not want to get up. A neighbor in the barracks was rummaging around nearby, looking for something in his boot. A deafening squeal, like a girl's, from a huge muscular man who saw a bug in his boot. The guy had to open his eyes. At sunset their new battle began, trumpets were blown, flags were raised everywhere, and the furious cries of soldiers could be heard, who were just waiting for orders. Countless swords and people mixed into one screaming bloody heap. A cacophony of different sounds filled the battlefield. Eric covered himself with a shield, barely holding back the enemy's onslaught. Someone grabbed him from behind, knocking him to the ground so that Eric could barely hold onto his sword. The soldier sat astride him, wielding not even a sword, but simply his fists, as if in a village brawl. Having somehow miraculously wriggled out from under it, he tried in panic to reach for his sword. Without it, he was completely defenseless on the battlefield. A guy from his army was killed by an arrow right in the head. Eric immediately rushed to the side out of the shooter's line of fire. He needed to move faster. Not noticing the enemy right away, he became easy prey. He didn't even have time to touch him before the enemy pierced his throat with one thrust. The sword passed right through him in the most vulnerable place, and from the shock he didn't even feel pain, not understanding what was happening to him at all. The body itself fell to its knees, not obeying the brain, which was rushing about in its death throes. Eric opened his eye. It was so painful. His whole body felt like it was burning, but he himself didn't realize anything. There were some circles floating before his eyes, or it was a face in a hood. Perhaps they were telling him something, or maybe it was a dream. Kneeling and with his head down, he looked down, and around him, like circles on water, there were ripples, and above him, billions of stars sparkled and the huge sky was reflected in this water. He opened his eyes, almost flying off the bed from the sound of a ladle hitting a frying pan. His first thought was that the dream was somehow too real. But Rick, his subordinate, shook the bug out of his boot again, screaming throughout the barracks. A feeling of déjà vu overwhelmed Eric. This had happened before. What a coincidence, he thought desperately. Fight! He covers himself with a shield, which barely holds up under the heavy blows of the sword. His throat is pierced with a sword, blood gushes from the torn area, and Eric is blinded by pain. The enemy is too fast. The guy's body clumsily tries to dodge, but flies back to fall on his back and never get up again. He wakes up again in the morning, immediately clutching his throat, from where blood was gushing just a few moments ago. Before his eyes stood the image of the enemy, his merciless, maniac-like gaze, and the bloody sword flying straight at his neck. He defends himself, trying to dodge, and it feels so real, as if it were actually happening. But he is pierced again with a sword, just like all those times before, and his body later hits the ground with a loud thud, still bleeding. The battle continues around him, but he no longer sees it, just as he does not see that around him. On the ground parched by the scorching sun, a scarlet liquid is spreading in circles. He tries to get up in some dark place. His body hurts terribly, as if a column of carts had driven over him, and someone whispers from behind, suggesting that he finally give up. A faceless figure under a hood beckons him to come to him, assuring him that he cannot, and that it is better to give in to this despair. He sits, not even turning to face the creature, but every word echoes inside him, resonating. And it drives him to blind rage. These words are very familiar to him. Eric's teeth clench, and his gaze becomes completely insane. It's early morning again. The ladle is banging on the frying pan, and the soldier is yelling, waking up the camp. Eric is very thoughtful. Everything repeats itself, down to the smallest details. It's starting to drive you crazy. Deciding to test his guess, he tells Rick that there is a bug in the boot. He looks at it with disbelief, and it seems as if it is written on his face that he doesn't believe in this joke. But the insect is indeed there, and Rick screams again, shaking it out of there. The man crushes it with his foot so hard that you can hear the crushed chitinous shell crunching. Rick shouts at the guy's back that the joke is idiotic and why he planted a bug on him. But Eric leaves without turning around, throwing back that he saw him crawl in. Leaving the barracks, he sighs heavily, because he sees the beetle's corpse for the 18th time, and even gets the feeling that this is forever. Since childhood, he trained with the sword every day, sparing no effort. A mercenary who settled in their village taught him how to handle a sword, not skimping on praise. It was from him that he first heard that he could become a knight. One could even say that this mercenary sowed the seeds of this dream and generously seasoned them with his approval. A knight, there is so much behind this one word. He is the one who can single-handedly slay 1,000, change the course of a battle, an invincible hero. The mercenary in the pub, when they were drinking, would always make fun of him. They were especially amused by his dream, and they said that he would not even make a free worker. At that time, there was not a single living place on him. Wounds appeared faster than they healed, so Eric often resembled a mummy. Every time he was laughed at for his dream, he looked at his sword, wondering if he should even try if he had no talent. But these thoughts seemed to give him strength, and he went to train, despite his injuries and fatigue. While the others were resting, he swung his sword like a man possessed, not sparing himself. At any time of the year, even in the bitter cold, he went out into the forest with a sword. And this bore fruit. Through hard work he achieved growth in skills and, most importantly, he saw the results. But even this was not enough. At one point it was as if the ground was knocked out from under Eric's feet. This hope of becoming a knight began to shatter into pieces. The opponent's sword knocked the wind out of him, as if all his work, hopes and dreams had been thrown away. A boy from his own village challenged Eric to a duel and knocked the sword out of his hands with such ease, as if those years of training had not happened. The boy had a genius look that stayed with Eric for the rest of his life, looking at him with such boredom in his eyes, as if defeating him was a piece of cake. Falling to his knees, not so much from pain as from the realization of his own insignificance, he could not move. For the first time he thought that all his dreams would never come true, because there were such geniuses, in comparison with whom his efforts were in vain. And yet, he returned to the forest, beating the tree with his sword, as if it were the last time, cherishing the thought that he would still become a knight. Without even noticing that his teeth were already grinding from the strain, that steam was escaping from his mouth, and that drops of sweat were already rolling down his face. His sword was shaking from the tension in his hands, and the naked eye could see scratches and marks from constantly hitting the wood. There was one thought in my head that I needed to train, constantly, again, without slowing down, until I lost my pulse, even when I had no strength. By morning the tree was completely covered with nicks and marks, holding within itself the rage and blind hope of a desperate man. Eric looked at him in a frenzy. He had almost no strength left, but it seemed that even these traces of persistent training were not enough. Gritting his teeth tightly, he was not going to give up so easily. Years of training, blood, sweat and tears could not just go to waste, because his dream was not yet fulfilled. Overcoming himself, his weakness, he dealt that very last blow, for which he did not have the strength, but he had the will to win and achieve a goal. Without stopping for a second, he nevertheless became the commander of a company, or rather the so-called rabble in the royal army. Eric called out to the guy sitting idle on the box, his subordinate, Jackson. He turned to him, addressing him as befits a commander, who, although he did not enjoy special respect among them, but his rank had power. Eric asked to cover for him on the morning shift, and with the captain's characteristic firmness in his voice, it didn't sound quite like a request. Jackson stood up, groaning, reluctantly, but accepted the request, noticing that the commander owed him a debt. Rick looked after Jackson with disapproval, whispering to Eric that the guy was definitely a cat, with whom you had to keep your ears open, because he always had his own mind. Ignoring his words about Jackson, the captain caught Rick's attention, who had already thought that he was going to pin something on him. The man's eyes widened in surprise and his mouth dropped open when he heard Eric's request to teach him the heart of the beast. But he immediately pulled himself together, adopting a mocking look, reminding him that he had already tried to master this technique, but had failed and had abandoned the matter. That same evening, Eric was struck by the enemy's sword again. Just like the times before, unfortunately, nothing had changed, and he still could not withstand his blows. But despite this, Eric continued to fight, training with Rick in a move that would help him resist this monster. Once again they stand in columns, awaiting orders. The setting sun has already painted the sky in soft colors and left so as not to see the bloody carnage that will now take place here. The warriors give a victorious cry and rush into the attack. None of them knows who will survive and who will be crushed by this meat grinder. But some of them know a little more, so he sees an arrow flying towards him, shot by an experienced shooter. And that's why he manages to dodge, letting it pass right where his chin was, allowing it to pass by his neck. Now he covers himself with a shield from a blow from behind. It makes a loud sound, but it dissolves into 1,000 of the same. Eric is extremely focused. The guy behind, from another department, after so many repetitions, Eric managed to remember him well. This guy will soon die, unable to withstand the onslaught of the enemy, no matter how desperately he fights. But fate can be thwarted, Eric decided, jumping with his shield right under the enemy's arrow, protecting the soldier. Distracted by the commander, he did not see how the enemy was flying at him from above with a sword at the ready. Time seemed to stand still. This soldier would not have had time to dodge if it weren't for Eric, who jumped on top of that guy himself, who, naturally, missed, not expecting this. It was he, his death, who had just dealt the final blow to the soldier who had fallen under his sword. They would meet soon. This guy is a real maniac and sadist. His eyes burn with bloodlust every time he kills someone, as if he was possessed by a demon. Eric took a breath in and out. He was dying from having his throat torn out 20 times already, and each one felt unbearable pain. But now he was completely ready to face him again. With a terrible grin and crazy eyes, he pointed his sword at him, preparing to make his terrible lunge again. Rick swung the axe, passing it right in front of Eric's face, proving his point that he always closed his eyes. To close your eyes in the middle of a fight is tantamount to death, and that is exactly what he did, and that is why he lost. Now, for the first time, he saw the tip of the sword right before it plunged into his throat. Eric no longer feared death, because it would make him stronger. I dodged, for the first time when I was able to not close my eyes, but to keep an eye on the sword. The body worked on its own, on reflexes. Passing within a couple of centimeters of his neck, so that the whistling sound of the pierced air could be heard. He immediately jumped back, leaving the enemy behind him. It was true that it cost him a lot of effort, but it was too early to relax. Swinging his sword with all his might, Eric turned around, ready to strike, his heart pounding like crazy, and the adrenaline drenching his mind. A scream of horror froze in his throat from the realization that the sword was about to plunge into his throat again. When he turned, it was flying straight at him again. Blood spurted out of the sword hole as the body fell straight onto the dusty ground. And again he is in this strange place, the figure in the boat offering him surrender for the 21st time, while he comes to his senses, sitting on his knees. But Eric doesn't even hear her words. A mad fire lights up in his eyes. He was able to dodge, which means he can win. He needs one more try. A new day, the sound of a ladle hitting a frying pan has become familiar. You can even ignore it. Step by step, try by try, Eric has time, so he can move forward. Burning with the determination of these thoughts, he woke up earlier. This is already the 33rd attempt. The commander is getting better at seeing the tip of the sword, and he is also absolutely not afraid. He dodges. Now you need to turn faster than that soldier, so as not to give him even the slightest advantage. But the sword from the second attack cuts his throat again. Even turning faster, Eric could not parry this attack. He falls to the ground, face down. An amulet on a simple rope falls from his neck. It was not visible under his clothes, but the sword passed right through that place. Even when he was a mercenary, the commander exterminated a large number of monsters near one village. The battle was exhausting, and the creatures were ferocious. The village chief could not pay with money. It was a very poor settlement, so no one would take on their task, but he gave Eric something more valuable. The guy looked at his palm in surprise, or rather at what was in it. It was very unexpected. A very beautiful amulet. If you looked at it for a long time, it seemed that billions of stars in it were winking at him. It was impossible to take your eyes off it. The old man said one thing that Eric wanted to hear then, that this amulet would help him fulfill his deepest desire. Lying in a pool of his own blood, he looked at the mysteriously shining artifact. Was it really because of it that he was living this day over and over again? Eric thought with his fading consciousness. Despite the wound, he still tried to get up, without even thinking. It seemed to him that he couldn't give up like that. His throat wasn't pierced. Eric saw the look in his killer's eyes when he said he was going to show mercy. He was smiling. And he pierced him right in the place where the heart beat under the armor. It seemed that this pervert enjoyed killing people. While bandaging his hands, the commander decided to somehow interrupt the chain of events that had become boring to him, so he told Rick that he had put a bug in his boot. He, of course, shouted, "What kind of stupid jokes does the commander allow himself so early in the morning?" But Eric didn't even pay attention to this. Today he was going to win, so he stunned Rick by saying that he was going to show him the heart of the beast. He immediately stopped screaming, and as soon as he heard this, the smile disappeared from his face, replaced by disbelief and surprise. Rick swings the axe again right next to his face, cutting through the air with force and not holding back. Eric dodges, no longer closing his eyes and seeing everything that is happening around him, so the axe whistles past his chin. After a successful reception, energy and determination come rushing in with renewed vigor. Standing in a stance with his sword at the ready, he offers Rick a fight. He, naturally, agrees, immediately swinging his axe, forcing Eric to dodge as quickly as possible, not giving him a chance to relax. Rick flies towards him, feeling the excitement of battle. He is infuriated that the commander is dodging without going on the offensive. Another swing of the axe barely grazed the cheek, but the weapon was sharpened, so even a single light contact was enough to cause blood to spurt. Now is the time to attack. His technique is imperfect. Many laugh at him, but for now, this is the most useful. Rick knocks the sword out of his hands with one blow of his axe. Again, the commander's body goes numb. This couldn't happen, he thought. His comrade says with annoyance that it would have been nice if Eric's lunge had drawn at least a little blood, since it was the most impressive of all that he had shown. Eric remembered the feeling of being stabbed in the throat, every single detail, comparing it to Rick's clumsy explanations. There was confidence in his enemy's sword. He struck with a readiness to kill, without hesitation or doubt. After a large number of attempts, which were already more than 120, during their training with Rick, he suddenly stopped, asking if the commander had gone crazy. Eric's arm was torn and bleeding profusely, but he still held his sword tightly, ready to fight. Sweat was pouring off him, he was breathing heavily, barely clutching the sword, but he was laughing as if he had gone completely mad, looking like a complete psycho. In the evening they clashed again, but the commander was unlucky. Despite all his preparation, the enemy struck him again, piercing his shoulder. Eric fell straight onto his back, looking death straight in the face as she stepped on his breastplate with her boot. He even became scared from her gaze. When he again said that he would be glad, perhaps, to show mercy, and pointed his sword at Eric, he looked without looking away. He was almost shaking with rage as the tip of the sword hovered over his face, and he couldn't take it anymore and told the soldier that he would die tomorrow. The morning began again with a bug, which became a pretext for Rick to go on duty for the captain. Having thrown this to him, Eric, without waiting for an answer, left. Rick stared after him in surprise, asking the empty bodies sleeping in the barracks why the captain had given such orders. Meeting a red-haired man wiping away sweat on the street, Eric called out to him too. Without slowing down, he demanded in an orderly manner that he get him a dagger and a shield, and that he would give him the money later. He tried to be indignant, but the captain no longer listened to him. Jackson, who was watching this scene, noticed that they were constantly blaming everything on the commander, not being afraid of Rick, who immediately remembered his axe. The sword plunged into the wood again and again with monstrous force, piercing it as deeply as possible. It was incredibly hard for Eric. These eternal attempts put moral pressure on him, because he had already become better, so why not give up? But precisely because such a path had been taken, it would have been foolish to give up without overcoming this wall. Still, repeating this day over and over again, he mastered the heart of the beast, which was previously beyond his control. Mastered that monstrous piercing blow of a true killer fighting to survive. Today he was prepared like he had never been before. Checking his gear, he knew for sure that he would survive and continue to live. They met. Only Eric saw this picture more than 100 times, and his opponent for the first time. He took the blow on his battered shield, having already withstood similar blows more than once. Now parry with a straight sword, because the shield couldn't withstand it and crumbled into a pile of splinters. Turning around, striking him straight in the head with the sword, while he was bent over in pain. People like him are not called geniuses for nothing, because they can attack from any position. The soldier flies, pointing the sword upward. Eric dodges, letting the attack pass his neck without the slightest concern. He moves forward by inertia, behind his back. Eric grabs hold of it to turn around faster. His opponent also wastes no time and makes another attack with the confidence of a killer. Eric raises his sword in response, keeping up with his opponent. The main thing here is speed. Their swords fly at each other at different angles. One of them must break when it hits the other. and the steel shatters into pieces against a correctly positioned sword. Eric's opponent loses his weapon. Everyone understands that this is the end, because he is defenseless. The archer on the rise takes aim at Eric, covering his soldier who has lost his sword. But the arrow is not destined to reach the commander. It is intercepted in flight by a precise blow from an axe and broken into 2 useless parts. Rick runs towards the shooter, ignoring Jackson shouting something at him, a veil of rage covering his eyes. With one lunge, Eric pierces the soldier's throat. He still doesn't believe that it happened. It seems like his eyes are about to fall out of their sockets. He is conscious. The wound was not serious enough for him to die immediately, but blood is spurting out of his neck, causing him to fall to his knees. There is not a drop of doubt in Eric's eyes. He has already won. Now he too will show mercy, already raising his sword over the soldier's head. But he does not pierce the body, as the other did, but with one swing of the sword he cuts the head off the shoulders so that it flies off somewhere upward. The wall he couldn't overcome is finally crumbling. The enemy is defeated, and Eric now feels as if the shackles have been removed from him. The moment of triumph did not last long. A strong inhuman paw throws him away from the body, so that he just flies for some time, and then buries himself in the ground. The pain seems to knock the wind out of him. It seems like he is screaming, but his chest is so tight that he cannot take a breath. Creatures like these are called frogs. They seem to be created to kill. His inhuman face, hanging over Eric, looks like some kind of mask. He turns out to be the teacher of the soldier who was just killed. The commander doesn't have enough strength to get up. Muffled wheezing comes from his chest. He can only watch as the frog approaches him. He swings his axe, not shouting, but as if stating a fact, telling people to prepare for death. Suddenly, Rick jumps out right in front of Frog, parrying his attack with his axe blow, his face fiercer than ever, ready to kill for his own. Frog holds the blow in front of his emotionless face, and the sound of weapons colliding can be heard. The enemy nearby wants to finish off the commander, who is writhing on the ground in pain, and he is already pointing his spear at his chest. As Jackson attacks him from the side, cutting off his head with one blow of his dagger, and in his usually indifferent eyes now sparkles real rage. Meanwhile, Rick and Frog stop opposite each other. Neither of them is wounded yet, but the soldier is ready to stand up for his commander even against this creature. Rick's gaze is much more frightening than usual. Now he is serious, collected and ready to fight, like a real berserker. But Frog simply turned his back on him, thinking that this battle, where one of them would die, was not worth it, and went into the thick of the battle. The enemy was already rushing towards Captain Jackson, who was rescuing him from behind. He saw him, but he could do nothing with the body on his shoulders. But behind the enemy there was already Luke with his sword, and with one swing he cut the enemy in half. Thus, they, covering each other, gathered in one place, like a real squad, ready to cover each other's backs and kill for a comrade. Lying on his subordinate's shoulder, Eric allowed himself to close his eyes. He had done a good job today. Cries of retreat were heard everywhere. Soldiers were running from the battlefield. The tense, unpredictable battle was finally ending, like this endless day. Eric was lying again in the place where he usually ended up after his death. It was cool and calm, if not for someone's whisper. The figure of the boatman shone his lantern at him again, persuading him to go with him, since it had taken him so many attempts just for one day, and there would be more walls to come. As soon as the creature mentioned fate, something seemed to click in Eric's head, like, what fate is he talking about? There is no such word for him. He weaves his own destiny, and these walls on his path are created for him to overcome. The faceless figure whispered that he really wanted to see his eyes, full of ambition and hope, grow dim, and his ardor and bold words disappear into oblivion. The body ached terribly when the captain opened his eyes, and above his head was the ceiling not of the usual barracks, but of a medical ward, with Rick sitting next to him. Exchanging the usual barbs, the commander forgot himself and reminded Rick what he used to do, who reacted instantly, tightly covering Eric's mouth with his palm. A little later, the red-haired one, Kai, came to him, immediately reminding the commander about the fee, because it really did cost money to place some soldier in the medical ward. The commander looked at Kai suspiciously, realizing that he was not lying, but immediately noted that he had not seen him on the battlefield, for which he received a discount from the redhead. Even closer to the evening, Jackson came to him. Without much ceremony, he simply threw a tin can at him, ordering him to smear it twice a day. There was an ointment there that Jackson usually used, and this really surprised the captain. Hans also came and sat down right on the floor in front of the captain's bed, and began to read a prayer. He could not stand it, saying that he was not going to die. Already at night, lying at the very exit of the tent, the captain thoughtfully stared at the ceiling, pondering the behavior of his soldiers. The last person to visit him today was Luke, although it felt like he just wandered in by accident. Just looking at the captain, he immediately left, without even looking up from eating his apple. Besides Eric, there were 2 other soldiers in the room who were not very talkative, mostly sleeping. Suddenly, she, an elf, obviously one of the authorities, entered their tent and asked which of them was the commander of the 444th detachment. Eric raised his eyebrows in surprise. Why did she need the captain of the rabble? Had they really already done something? The commander of another detachment lying with them raised his eyebrows in surprise and exclaimed in surprise, naming the girl's race. She asked him what unit he was from, and without expressing a drop of dissatisfaction, the man gave his name, already sensing that trouble was brewing. The girl's face changed and became stern, and she asked if it was normal in their company to see a senior officer and call him by his race. Deciding not to waste any more time, Eric spoke up, attracting the attention of the girl who could be the commander of the 4th company. But she merely said that the captain was doing well and that she expected him to continue to succeed, and then turned around to leave. Suddenly the elf turned around, looked sideways at the guy, who was trying not to stand out, and asked his name. He hesitated a lot and forced out some stupid name that he had obviously just come up with. The girl only narrowed her eyes at this, but didn't ask any questions. She simply turned around and, under the attentive gaze of the guys, left for good. Having finally gotten out of bed, Eric noticed that the pain and weakness in his body had almost passed, and that strength was returning to his body, so he could start training. Early in the morning, when he was about to leave for the training ground, another commander shouted at him, saying that for a private, he was trying too hard. But Eric didn't even pay attention to him. In the dawn sun he stood in a stance, holding his sword, and simply looked at him. Suddenly, the guy who called himself Krang called out to him, asking what Eric was doing. He briefly explained, thinking that he would leave him alone. But he continued asking questions, despite the short, even rude answers. Suddenly he asked if there was anything he wanted to become while keeping his life. Holding the sword in front of him, Eric hesitated. Usually when he spoke about what he wanted to become he was laughed at, but that was no reason not to speak, so he answered anyway. Surprisingly, Krang didn't say anything. He even seemed to look shocked, didn't laugh, didn't make any strange expression on his face. When Eric told him about it, he chuckled, saying that it was just something that had occurred to him. Getting up from his stump, he suddenly said that, looking at Eric, he realized what he needed to do next, and simply turned his back to him. However, as if remembering something, he turned around and told him that when Eric became a knight, he should remember his name. Passing by his squad's tent, Eric met Jackson sitting on a box, who immediately asked how his wounds were healing. In response to his gratitude, he told him to quickly return to duty. The newfound friend wished the captain good night when they were already getting ready for bed. In the morning my head started to hurt from the songs from the street. They were heard yesterday too. But Eric managed to leave the tent, and now they were shouting again. The neighbor next to him was shouting loudly, demanding breakfast. The captain even thought about how bad his character was, since he was shouting like that for the 2nd morning in a row. Suddenly it struck him that these 2 events could not be a coincidence, but he needed to make sure. As he passed Jackson, he asked how his wounds were healing and lamented that the captain should return to the detachment quickly. Exactly like yesterday, could it be that he was killed while he was sleeping? But that's impossible. Another wall. Before he had time to recover from the first one, a second one immediately appeared in front of him. Night fell on the camp, but Eric did not sleep, wondering who was behind this murder, and most importantly, how it happened. A thought occurred to him. The probability that the killer was one of his own was very high. The only suspect was the elf who had come recently. There was only one entrance to the tent, and Eric was positioned right next to it, so all he had to do was see and stop the killer. As if a sharp needle had suddenly pierced him from somewhere above, he didn't even notice that anyone had entered at all. Jerking to pull out the needle, Eric realized that it was poisoned. His body began to twitch, and unbearable pain appeared. The neighbor next door was already dead from the same poisonous needle, and foam was coming out of his mouth. The killer stopped in front of Krang's bed. Eric saw it. He had enough strength to get off the bed, but he still couldn't do anything. The figure in the cloak raised his sword over the peacefully sleeping boy, apparently to kill him for sure, without waiting for the poison to take effect. Eric's face was distorted with horror. He felt like he was dying. It was a very strong paralyzing poison. Another figure appeared through the gap in the tent, and the cloaked killer wasn't even surprised to see it. It was the company commander, the elf who had come to them the day before. Eric sat on his bed, listening to the sounds of the third such morning, thinking hard about how to avoid death, since he couldn't even feel the presence. It seemed that the case was completely hopeless again, because even if he defeated the poisoner, he would have to deal with the battle elf. But from past experience, Eric was sure that a way out would be found. At first he tried to attract his tent neighbors, but that quarrelsome commander had a completely different opinion. He cursed loudly, calling him a psycho, while he walked around the tent with a sword. Despite the fact that Eric ignored his jibes in every possible way, the captain still managed to comment. Unexpectedly, while they were arguing in the tent, Krang appeared, quite content with life, and immediately became curious about what they were arguing about. Eric immediately started a conversation with him, while the commander made himself more comfortable on the bed, muttering something unflattering. Despite his principles of not initiating a conversation, he needed to know who Krang was, because their lives depended on it. He thought about what to answer the captain, and was absolutely serious, but Eric still had the thought that he had asked too directly. Krang's answer made even the captain, who was about to go to bed, jump. The guy simply said that he could not tell him this secret. When asked why, he answered that the situation was too complicated. It was clear that he was not lying, so there was no point in putting pressure on him. But the man, who had lost all sleep, was not satisfied with this mood, and he decided to get to the bottom of Krang at any cost. The guy came almost right up to him with such a frightening face when he heard from the captain a very serious assumption that he was a spy. There was such determination in his eyes when he said that he had not betrayed and would not betray the kingdom that the topic was quickly dropped. Night fell again, already the third attempt. Eric was on duty at the entrance, not even planning to go to bed, which is why he ran into a new round of complaints from the captain. Having lost all fear of being weird and like a psycho, he told the entire tent that a killer would soon come and that they needed to cooperate to survive. And he was, indeed, taken for a psychopath, completely out of his mind due to paranoia, and the captain simply turned over to the other side. Krang said nothing, but did not even open his eyes, continuing to breathe quietly, indicating that there was no danger. Literally at that very second, the wall of the tent was torn apart with a crunch by a poisonous needle flying straight at Eric, which reached its target. The killer, no longer hiding, flew into the tent, throwing the second needle at the captain lying on the bed, tearing out his throat. Then he charged at Krang with a sword, piercing his chest without wasting a single second, spending no more than a minute on all three murders. Another morning beginning with the song of soldiers who have no voice at all. When Eric came to his superiors to tell them about the planned assassination attempt so that they could send reinforcements, they advised him to shut up and get out of there. That same night he stood at the wall of the tent to anticipate where the killer would come from and raise a cry. Just as he was about to scream, a poisoned blade pierced his throat, and he was unable to make a single sound except for the gurgling of blood. The killer slipped past him like a shadow into the tent, wasting no time. The next night he decided to sit in ambush and watch for him. With his sword at the ready he stood frozen next to the tent. But the killer was more thoughtful, and from somewhere to the side, Eric couldn't even see where, a poisoned blade flew into his throat again. It was already the 20th morning, and there was still no progress. Despair began to creep up on the commander with renewed vigor, because he still could not resist. When they were training with Rick, he made a comment about Jackson being a wily lynx. When asked why he calls him that, Rick simply replied that he is a disgusting pervert because he usually attacks from behind and runs away. So Eric came to him and asked him what he should do if a guy like Jackson stabbed him in the back. He thought for a moment without showing even the slightest bit of surprise, and didn't even ask where the commander was asking his comrade such questions, but fell silent, thinking. When Eric heard that he had no idea, since he had never seen anyone survive, his face seemed to turn gray with surprise. But Jackson was absolutely serious. There was not a drop of boasting or a sense of superiority in his eyes. he was simply stating a fact. To the amazed look, he explained that to do this you need to have eyes in the back of your head. To prove his point, Jackson asked the commander if he could see that cart, and when he bowed his head in surprise, he explained that it was behind the barracks. And she was indeed there, but so far away that it felt like Jackson had eyes in the back of his head. But that wasn't all, he said, as if it were a given, that she was going to break down now. And Eric saw that a wheel flew off the cart with a deafening crunch, and it began to fall over to the side. He looked at it in amazement, turning his gaze to Jackson, who was sitting with his back to the barracks and could not even see the cart. Of course, Eric asked him to explain how he did it, and he pointed to his ear and said that it was all about the sound. He heard it all. He rose slowly, saying that the commander needed to practice more, sharpen his senses and listen carefully for sounds. Once again, night spread over the military camp, clouds slowly crawled across the sky, and light poured from the medical tent. He no longer stood guard near the tent, did not try to stop the killer by lying in wait for him. Eric listened, trying to understand what was happening outside. He recognized the patrolman's measured steps and the tapping of his sword on the ground immediately. The crackling of the flames in the bowl was also clearly audible to his still untrained ear. He even closed his eyes from the effort, but Eric could not recognize any steps or rustling in the already familiar sounds, of which there were not so many. While he lay like that, he didn't even hear the whistle of the poisoned needle that pierced his throat, immediately bringing with it hellish pain. Eric continued to come to Jackson to be taught. This time he told him that by the sound you can determine whether its source is close or far away. Remembering something, he snapped his fingers sharply right in front of the commander's face and explained that the sound was a wave that was reflected everywhere. And Eric listened, picking out the sounds that were mixed in this interweaving of waves. Flags fluttered behind him. How many of them were there? The sound of boots hitting the ground, 2 closer, 3 further, going from right to left, he distinguished, singling out this wave. Some of them were unfamiliar and alien, he could not yet distinguish, and some he could not even hear. Suddenly, his almost meditation was interrupted by Krang's voice, asking what kind of training he was doing now. Eric closed his eyes again and asked him why he thought this was training when he was just sitting there. He really wanted Krang to leave now. But he suddenly asked him again that Eric was not one to waste time. It was the 33rd day since he tried to listen to the killer, but each time he failed. The commander did not have time to react. Every single day he saw Krang's dead body, with a sword sticking out of it, and the entire area around him covered in blood. He listened again all day long, more, better, clearer. Now he heard someone come up to him and open their eyes. It turned out to be Krang, who even flinched, so abruptly did Eric open his eyes when he tried to sneak up on him. Finally today he heard a poisoned needle being thrown at him, and what's more, he dodged it with one turn of his neck, so that it stuck into the pillow. Instantly pulling the dagger out from under the pillow, Eric swung it, cutting off the killer from himself, who, as the owner of good reflexes, managed to dodge the blow. He fell to the ground, entangled in his robe. The commander stood at attention. Now the enemy had nowhere to go. The poisoner is no longer invisible death, which means he has absolutely no advantage. Now it is completely on Eric's side. But even when he was in a disadvantageous position, he delivered quite swift blows, not allowing anyone to relax even for a second. He ripped the skin of his chest with his dagger, causing Eric to jump back, gritting his teeth. Suddenly, the pale face of an elf, the commander of the 4th Company, appeared through a slit in the tent fabric. Without wasting time to not give the girl an advantage, the commander rushed towards her with a dagger, although her face expressed extreme surprise. Suddenly, the killer threw a bunch of poisoned needles in their direction. Apparently, the elf was not on his side, since he reacted to her like that. At this time, the elf pushed off the ground with force and jumped over Eric, paying absolutely no attention to his attack. The needles cut right into her cloak, but did not hurt her. After all, elven agility is no joke. This was his chance. While his opponent was distracted, he lunged at him with a dagger in his hand, as if he had a sword. But he parried the blow of the dagger. Although it was not easy, cursing became too difficult for him. The situation turned completely against him, so he finally hurried to hide so as not to be killed. Krang stood behind, unusually serious, even frightened. He was sure that the killer was coming for his soul. When Eric replied that he knew, he became very tense and immediately asked where he got such information. To which the commander explained, as if it were self-evident, that for the sake of people like him and that commander no one would send a killer. The elf standing nearby chuckled, confirming. She looked at him with completely different eyes, adding without a hint of a smile that the captain did have brains. Noticing the movement of her sword, Eric understood that she was now going to get rid of the evidence, so he kept his dagger at the ready. Suddenly, Krang spoke up and told the elf that he had a request that no one die today, and he looked at everyone intently. Eric looked at him too, and in Krang's eyes he saw gratitude mixed with bitterness that he could not express in words. The elf bowed obediently, as if to her master, saying that now everything would be done. And then they looked at the unconscious platoon commander. Krang immediately asked for him too, if he was still alive. The image of a serious gentleman completely changed the frivolous, good-natured Krang, who noted that it was necessary to clean up here so that no one knew about the killer. Without saying a word, everyone looked at the candle that was quietly burning to the side. Soldiers with buckets in their hands ran from all sides to the medical ward. The fire was strong, and smoke was billowing in all directions. Eric sat next to the unconscious platoon leader, trying to cough out the toxic smoke that had filled his lungs. At this time, the elf is with Krang in a forest filled with night sounds. They were having a quiet conversation, and unable to bear it, she asked if it was because of this guy that the gentleman had changed his mind, and he simply replied that it was. She remained silent, looking away, not answering his question. He found himself in that strange place again, the boatman sailing past but saying nothing, and Eric looking straight at him, his back straight and proud. His dry lips parted, and he whispered only one phrase, that he would meet him again. Eric was not surprised. He calmly answered the figure that he would wait. The next morning he was packing his few belongings after his stay in the medical ward. Suddenly, the platoon captain, who was sitting on a box nearby, called out to him and asked him, as if with displeasure, why he had pulled him out of the fire. To which Eric, quietly snorting, simply replied that they were comrades, and it was his duty. Tom apparently felt ashamed for having sucked so much blood from this guy, so he asked, trying to awkwardly show friendliness, if he was returning to the squad. When he heard a positive answer, he made Eric turn around with his sudden warning. A rumor spread through the camp that all the trenches were cursed. At the same time, near the barracks of the rabble squad, a fight was breaking out between Luke and Rick. The former grabbed the big guy by the shoulder and shouted something to him. Grabbing the impudent fellow by his clothes, Rick lifted him above his head. The soldiers who saw this not only did not rush to separate them, they ran as far as possible. Luke, who had miraculously escaped, received a powerful blow from Rick's fist right to the jaw. In the midst of all this bedlam, almost no one noticed the appearance of the commander, who had heard the screams long before. Eric attracted the attention of the guys who were too engrossed in the showdown and had already managed to get their weapons out, and forced them to stop. The commander opened his eyes abruptly, almost screaming. He felt someone's presence close to him. It was Jackson. He was very surprised that he was heard, because he usually went out very quietly. To which Eric hastened to assure him that he had not woken him up, and that he himself was already getting ready to get up to go to training. Jackson turned around and noticed that the captain was already getting a pretty good feel for sounds, and if he continued like this, he would get much better at it. The sun was just beginning to roll over the horizon, lazily illuminating the lands with its light, while the captain was training the strength of his arms on an old tree. As he was returning to camp, he met Hans, who, despite the heavy boulder on his back and the push-ups, greeted him. In the tent, from the very morning, the showdown between Rick and Luke began again. The first one turned over the bed with the sleeping guy and sat on top. He, without even hiding or hurrying, crawled out from under them and reached for his sword, promising to give Rick a good beating. The fight that had just begun was interrupted by the appearance of the commander and Hans, who ordered them to stop. Without wasting any time, Rick complained about Luke shirking his duties and wanting to leave them all without breakfast. Luke sighed in displeasure when the commander, already in a commanding tone, told him to take care of the food, but he agreed. He also put Rick, who was sniffing his clothes, in his place, telling him not to sweat over trifles, but to get down to business, which never gets any less. Yes, they don't have any fights planned right now, so the explosive guy has nowhere to put his energy. Taking the sword, the commander ordered him to go out to the training ground. Rick hit him right in the liver, causing Eric, who didn't have time to react with his sword, to almost double over in pain. Roaring that the commander was a weakling, he swung his axe straight at the guy who was covering himself with his sword, sparks from the clash of weapons flying in all directions. Another clever block against the opponent's axe. They are both focused, jokes aside, they are really training now. Finding an opportune moment, Eric raises his sword, but Rick manages to dodge it, and it passes right over his face. His opponent, catching his axe on his sword, brazenly pulls him towards himself and grabs him by the shirt. And with all his might he throws him to the ground, pressing down with his hand so that he cannot move. It's as if he's deliberately hitting a sore spot with his words, asking why he's so boring when he thought his skills had improved. Eric clutches the sword in his hands. He no longer has any uncertainty. He has proven to himself that he is capable of moving forward and becoming stronger. Rick doesn't smirk when he looks into his eyes. He probably thinks that the commander has pathetic skills, but the fire that he burns with doesn't let him get bored. From the sky, which had been frowning in the last hours, a sudden downpour of heavy rain poured down, as if someone had pierced the clouds with a sword. Sitting in the tent, Rick, like a young lady, threw on a towel, carefully examined his feet, muttering something under his breath. Jackson was also drying himself. Luke was sleeping as usual, and Hans was praying. Suddenly, a redhead, outraged by the downpour that had come at such an inopportune moment, fell into the tent. He sat down on the bed and began to talk about the curse that hung over their camp, and that he himself would soon believe in it. Of course, the captain didn't believe in any curses, and he told the red-haired man that the command would soon put an end to all these rumors. Rick snorted with displeasure at the captain's training in stealth in the rain, saying that he was being silly, but Jackson, on the contrary, approved. An argument immediately began between the two. Of course Rick was the loudest, and Jackson weakly waved him off. Hans and Luke unexpectedly joined the conversation, offering to train the commander in their own ways. The command in the tent discussed the need to send a reconnaissance detachment, but at the same time it was necessary to fill the empty places in it. The elf immediately raised her voice on the second issue, proposing the commander of the 444th detachment. The chairman of their meeting looked at her doubtfully, showing his fear that he was out of his mind and would only get in the way. To which she quite seriously objected that the fairy's intuition told her a completely different result. Early in the morning, Eric was already in the elf's tent, where she informed him that he had been called up to the reconnaissance detachment. While the commander was getting ready, Kai chatted with him, trying to understand why Eric was called into that group, because it was completely illogical. Rick joked, offering to stay in the barracks if the commander didn't want to go, and that would be the end of it. To which the captain replied that cutting off the heads of commanders if something was not to his liking was Rick's prerogative, not his. Hans prayed to the side, begging some gods of his not to take his commander away from him, but to help him overcome the trials. Unexpectedly, even the sleeping Luke intervened in their conversation, quite seriously offering his candidacy in place of the commander. All eyes turned to him. It's not every day you hear such a proposal from a lazy person like him, but the captain again refused. Jackson also spoke up, clarifying that the reconnaissance would take place in the middle of the grass, which meant that every unusual sound would need to be picked out. Rick again shouted at him to shut up and stop teaching the commander all sorts of dirty tricks on the sly. Eric sighed. He had a very difficult choice in front of him. If he left now, then there would be no one to separate these guys. Due to Eric's lackluster skills, he was constantly transferred from one unit to another without being given a clear position. Rick rushed along, baring his teeth, with an axe at the ready, not hearing anyone around him. And an angry Jackson was flying straight at him with a curved knife in his hand. And only here did Eric take root, able to stand right between them so that no one would hurt each other and stop the fight. They continued to exchange barbs, but without physical violence, remaining combat ready and healthy. It was already daytime when 7 scouts set out from the camp and entered the forest, walking calmly for now, without hiding. The young commander kept looking back at Eric and finally couldn't resist and rudely called out to him, asking why he was in the clouds. He behaved defiantly, offering to defeat him in combat if there were any objections. Some members of the squad supported the red-haired man, starting to ridicule the commander as not being their equal. Suddenly he turned to everyone, shouting that if the enemy attacked, they would simply tear him to shreds, to which his supporters shouted back. Eric winced. The guys were too loud and self-confident. and the commander was still too young to understand anything about intelligence. Moving deeper into the forest, their commander suddenly fell to the ground, examining the tracks of some animal. With the air of an expert, he declared that these tracks were left by a wildebeest, and if they followed them, they would have a barbecue that evening. Eric raised his eyebrows in surprise, because he knew that wildebeests travel in herds of 20 individuals, and they would not be able to cope with such a group. He was not the only one, apparently, who disagreed with the commander. The guy next to him hissed that these were obviously the tracks of gazelles, not wildebeest. So they walked behind everyone, quickly getting along, and talked about everything that was interesting to both of them. It was already late at night when they had to make a halt, because all day they had been chasing non-existent wildebeest, and the detachment commander was very distressed about this. He reproached himself for his carelessness, not even suspecting that someone was hearing all his worries, both about reconnaissance and about the wildebeest. The next day they reached the Green Pearl, which their squad was supposed to check. The place was truly a pearl. Wherever you looked there was a huge carpet of thick, tall grass, and behind, somewhere far away, mountains were visible. Only after entering the thicket did the commander shout that they would cross the thicket, find the scouts, take the main ones prisoner and, in principle, distinguish themselves. Ed, who was following Eric, looked doubtfully into the thicket and wondered if they should go there at all. But nevertheless, it was the commander's order, and they advanced as if through a green sea. Ed continued to express doubts about the area, that there were no animals here, and in such thickets it was very strange. Like a bolt from the blue, in such silence, a strange sound was heard, as if an animal's paw had stepped on the ground. Eric immediately sensed the danger and a cold sweat began to roll down his back. A black panther ran past him, roaring, but did not attack. Everyone on the ground, Eric yelled, grabbing the captain by the head to make him duck. And just in time, an enemy arrow from an unidentified place pierced their comrade's head right through. The enemies, hiding in the dense thickets, found them first and prepared their crossbows to exterminate them to the last. And they ran through the tough, tall grass, not looking where they were going, trying to break away. But the enemies overtook them one after another, and they could not even repel their attack, but Eric was still alive and ran forward. But even he found himself surrounded on all sides by enemy scouts with no chance of getting out of this battle alive. However, he continued to run, trying to hide, even as the sun began to sink towards the horizon. He heard arrows from behind and dodged them using his ability to sense presence. But there were too many enemies, and he was alone, so arrows flew at his head constantly and in large numbers. Finally there were so many of them, and Eric was exhausted from the chase, that they caught up with him instantly, piercing his body right through. New attempts to rectify the situation failed at the negotiation stage. The commander did not hear him, and kept repeating about desertion and a psycho. And it all ended again with cries of an ambush, after which they were all killed at varying speeds by enemy scouts. Eric tried different routes. In one of them he was awaited by spearmen, piercing him from all sides. In the east there were crossbowmen who immediately fired at him, and Eric died under a hail of their arrows. In the north he was again surrounded by a detachment of spearmen, against whom he had no chance. Barely alive, he crawled along the ground like a hedgehog studded with arrows, while his enemies searched for him. Suddenly he crawled to a clearing where some strange flags were hanging fluttering on a pole. This was the place where the enemies were guarding. Before Eric could see anything else, the enemy's sword pierced his long-suffering throat, separating his head from his body. This attempt started just like all the others, so Eric didn't even listen to anything around him. He was wondering what the enemies were hiding in this grass. Ed even called out to him because Eric didn't react at all when the entire squad entered the thicket of grass. Their red-haired commander, having heard this, immediately decided to comment on his mental abilities, urging him to go into the thicket. One of the warriors looked askance at Eric, but asked him to be patient, citing some circumstances of the commander, to which the guy replied that he didn't give a damn about them. Narrowing his eyes, Eric asked harshly if he really enjoyed licking the commander's son's ass and putting up with his antics. Having decisively pushed aside the peculiar bodyguard, Eric informed everyone that he was no longer going to put up with this state of affairs. Looking straight into the eyes of his so-called commander, Eric completely let go of himself, declaring that command was passing into his hands. The redhead's teeth began to grind with anger, and he first of all tried to humiliate him. Those two, Ed and the red-haired man's bodyguard, are the toughest guys in the entire squad, not counting the red-haired man and Eric, so they should be on his side. Their commander managed to calm down and took out his sword, ordering Eric to do the same, because only in this way could he take command for himself. The red-haired man's stance was really good. It was immediately obvious that he had been trained in fencing by someone experienced. Suddenly he yelled that he would not give him the victory just like that, because he had a mission that he had to fulfill. Eric shook his finger at him, saying that he talked too much and that he didn't need the sword, he would win without it. The excited guy rushed forward, wanting to finish off the upstart as quickly as possible. Eric also stood in a stance, putting his hand forward. He saw that he was being underestimated, and now it was just to his advantage, because such behavior leads to carelessness. Not a drop of doubt in his eyes, calm, measured movements now filled Eric's entire appearance as he parried the sword blow with his own hand. With one movement of his elbow, he seemed to have caught the commander and dealt him a crushing blow, from which the red-haired man's eyes darkened. He fell to the ground like a limp sack with a groan, right at Eric's feet. The squad froze in amazement, looking with all their eyes at the one who had just been called a half-educated person, a half-commander of psychos, but now he was proving the opposite. This time they were all still alive by evening, without having been ambushed in the tall grass once, since Eric was now leading them. No one expected something like this from the newly appointed captain, but he suddenly asked what Ed's dream was, and when he answered, he nodded. He asked the same question to another boy, who replied that he would like to live with his girlfriend and newborn child. The other soldiers responded as well, a little confused about what they really wanted most. The most serious dream turned out to be the redhead's. He wanted to revive his family, which was destroyed by his drunkard father. Turning to the squad, Eric quietly said that all these dreams could only come true if they survived. With the determination of a commander, he told them only 2 words: survive and return. Pointing to where to shoot at the level of a human head, he told Ed to do it, but he objected in bewilderment that there was no one there. Eric's face took on a completely uncompromising expression, and he sternly told him that he would not repeat it and that he must obey the commander's orders. Ed's arrow flew straight into the forehead of the enemy sitting in ambush. His comrades ran around shouting about an ambush. At that moment they attacked them, uttering a battle cry from the joy of hitting the enemy and revealing his position. Eric, with his former commander at his side, rushed into the attack with swords at the ready. This time the advantage was on their side. The enemies did not know where to expect an attack from, so they kept their swords to themselves and nervously looked around the thickets of thick grass, hearing the sounds of battle. Using the element of surprise, they managed to take the enemy by surprise and attack from behind, with the help of which they successfully reduced their numbers. The spectacle was not for the unprepared greenhorns. Heads flew off their bodies from the sword swings, gushing blood. The redhead's bodyguard did not stand aside, confidently mowing down enemies. Eric, of course, did not stand aside either. Being in the thick of the battle, he chopped off heads and pierced bodies. Despite the fact that the enemies desperately called for help, there were still far fewer of them left, and in the thickets of grass they no longer had the advantage. As more enemies came running to the cries for help, the squad had already taken up position, preparing to finish it off, and for now, all of them were still alive. And again the bloody massacre began. Blood splashes, people, limbs flew in all directions, mixing into one big screaming and ringing mass. Suddenly, the blue-eyed Black Panther that Eric saw for the first time appeared from the thicket. Then the enemies came across their detachment, because they were chasing after her, wanting to kill the animal that had somehow annoyed them. Eric skewered another enemy when the big cat that had made everything go according to plan today came into his sights again. Finally, they finished dealing with this detachment, leaving, of course, not a single survivor, which they immediately notified the captain about. After giving the order to move on, Eric saw the panther quietly sneaking behind them, but not attacking. Today there were more of them surviving than usual. Yes, not all of them, but there were still 6 of them, and that was already enough, so the commander confidently led them straight through the thickets. Knowing the exact locations of the troops, thanks to numerous repetitions, Eric attacked very accurately so that the enemy would not even notice that he had already died. The soldiers followed him like a guide, although they did not object to such zigzags, but they looked terribly dissatisfied. However, they were effective in clearing out all enemies in their path as quickly and as quietly as possible. When the red-haired man's bodyguard was outraged by the adopted route, he didn't even want to listen that it was the commander's order, trying to insist on his own. He even blocked Eric's path, holding his sword right in front of his neck and growling that one must have a conscience after all. His face took on a very determined expression when he said that he was ready to kill even him in order to survive, and Eric knew that he was not joking. The commander tried to reach his mind with very weighty arguments. For example, the retreat route was now full of enemies, and they were not allowed there. Ruzhik looked at the man he had previously considered a piece of trash, unworthy of respect, with a completely different look, but now it seemed he respected him more than anyone else. Eric looked straight into the frightened man's eyes, urging him to trust him, to believe that they would survive this hell. To everyone's surprise, especially to his bodyguard, Andrew called Eric captain for the first time, asking him to lead them. He allowed himself only a nod and immediately gave a new order. It was necessary to hurry. Everyone moved without objection, as the captain said with a goose step, feeling that the target of their reconnaissance was approaching them. The most dangerous stage was beginning. Eric had to lead his soldiers along a narrow corridor between two enemy units. If they ran into them, they would die. The tension in his entire body made the commander feel like he was no longer human. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it wanted to break his ribs. Finally they passed the terrible area without being noticed by anyone. Everything went exactly according to plan, but the sun continued to sink lower and lower. The soldiers stared in amazement at the place the captain had led them to, not believing their eyes that they had worked like devils all day for this. They came to the enemy camp, where, to be honest, they shouldn't have gone at all, because what is the enemy camp compared to their detachment? However, their attention was drawn to what the enemy soldiers were killing everyone who entered this field for, what they were so protective of. With their swords drawn, the soldiers began the final stage, so that their capture would become a secondary matter for the enemy, and they themselves would have a way out.